Hello, my econ students. Well, we're here to talk about the macroeconomy, and unfortunately, we're not here to do this in person because everything that we're talking about today is literally playing out before our eyes with the coronavirus, that putting us into recession, which is what we're going to talk about right here, what the government is doing about it, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And so a lot of this stuff is extremely relevant to everything that's happening right now as we speak. Things that are going to be in history books and economics books and medical books in the future, the things that we're living through right now. So this is really relevant. And again, I wish I was here to have this dialogue with you guys and explain it and take questions and discuss it with you all, but we got to do what we can. FYI, I am wearing shorts today, which is kind of weird, but I've tried to position the camera such that it only gets me from the waist up because I do not want you to be distracted by my legs as I'm going through this. But if you get a glimpse of them, just be forewarned. But anyway, excuse me. So here's the deal. What we're going to talk about first is what would cause our economy to be in recession or expansion. Okay, now, let me pause real quick and show you a new graph. Okay, I'm going to teach you guys a new graph. And I know you're probably looking at this saying, Mers, that's not a new graph. We've done supply and demand graphs before. Yes, we have. I'm going to use this as my basis to teach you a new graph. A graph that we call the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, which measures supply and demand for the economy as a whole. Okay, so bear with me for a moment. Now, FYI, on the test, you will not need to know this new graph. But I'm telling you right now, understanding it is going to significantly help you understand the things that we're going to talk about in just one moment. Okay, so try to bear with me. Now, this is a graph that you all know and love. Okay, I'm using this as my starting point to transition into a slightly different version of the same graph that we call our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. So here is just regular old supply and demand, and this supply and demand graph is measuring a specific market. Okay, one market. Let's say, for example, that it is measuring the pizza market. Okay, so I could write up here pizza market, and what this is going to show us is what the supply and demand are for pizza at any given moment. Okay, so it is the pizza market. Let's just say it could be anything, cars, corn, whatever. We're just going to say pizza. So you've got your supply, your upward sloping supply curve. Why upward sloping? Because as the price of pizza goes up, more people want to make pizzas because there's more money to be made in making pizzas, right? So upward sloping supply curve, we've learned about that already in Unit 2. Downward sloping demand curve, we know how that works. If the price of pizza is high, you are less likely to buy it. As the price of pizza drops, the quantity you purchase is going to increase, ergo demand is downward sloping. And on these axes, we measure the price of pizza and the quantity of pizza supplied and demanded. And of course, we have our magic point right here, our equilibrium. Now, let me transition a little bit real quick and tell you how we would look at this graph if we were measuring the entire economy. Okay, not just one specific market, not pizza, but let's say it was the entire economy. Okay, now there's going to be a couple changes. It's really the same graph and it's measuring the same thing, but when you talk about all the markets put together, it changes slightly, okay, the way we define it. So when we talk about supply, for example, again, it's not the supply of one particular thing. It's the supply of all the goods and services produced in our economy. And so the only adjustment we need to make there is we're going to add one little letter, and that is A, and that now stands for what we call aggregate supply. Okay, I'm going to write that out. You don't have to write it out if you're doing this on your own, but aggregate supply, okay, essentially the word aggregate is a fancy word. It just means the total of all the supply produced in America. In other words, all the things that we're making as a nation. Okay, so the aggregate supply is the total supply for all American goods. Now, same thing with demand, except we're going to call it aggregate demand. So we're just adding one letter. Okay, again, the A stands for aggregate, just like it does up here. Aggregate demand means the total demand for all American goods. Okay, not just by Americans. Americans aren't the only ones who buy American goods. Other countries also buy American goods. And so this measures how much we want and other nations want to buy American goods. So it's really still supply and demand. We're just talking about the supply of the entire nation and the demand for all the goods produced in that nation. Okay, now down here we have quantity, and again, if this was the pizza market, the question would be what is the supply of pizza and what is the demand for pizza, and that creates our equilibrium quantity of pizzas. Could be 100 pizzas, 1,000 pizzas, 1,000,000 pizzas, 2 pizzas, whatever. Right now we're measuring the pizza, we're not measuring pizzas, but we're measuring the entire economy. Okay, so think back to Unit 4, the one that you just tested over a couple days ago. Okay, what was that term? What did we learn? Is the total of all things made in this country. What do we call that? That's right, GDP. So GDP is still a quantity, it's just the total quantity of everything produced in this country. So instead of calling that quantity, I'm going to be a little bit more specific and call this GDP. Okay, again, it's a quantity, but it's the total quantity of everything produced in this country. And the only other adjustment we need to make here is to price. Instead of just calling it price, because pizza has a very specific price based on supply and demand, and when we're measuring the economy as a whole, we're going to call it price level. Okay, price level. And the reason we call it price level is because, as we know, not all prices are the same. Sometimes prices go up in certain markets, sometimes prices go down in certain markets. For example, right now you might notice gas prices very low, going down to, I saw $1.36 at the Sam's Club gas station the other day. So gas prices are going way low. Some other prices are going up. If you've tried to buy hand sanitizer on the internet, if you've tried to buy masks, if you've tried to buy toilet paper, if you try to buy several of these things, you might see the prices going up. So we can't just say there's a price in the economy. We say price level to generalize all the prices in the economy. Again, some could be going up, some could be going down, but generally speaking, they're going to go one way or the other. And so, bottom line is, if that confused you, don't be overly concerned about it. I'm just trying to show you what this graph looks like, or how we redefine it to measure the entire economy. Okay? And so, here is a graph. Here's the same graph, but now it's just got the official terms. Again, AS for aggregate supply, AD for aggregate demand, output, which is another way of saying GDP, they put that in parentheses, and then price level. Okay, so basically, this is the supply and demand graph for the whole economy. That's all you really need to know. Okay, this is what the supply and demand graph looks like for the entire economy. So let's go back to our notes real quick, and I'm going to come back to that graph pretty regularly as we go through this. All right. What would cause a recession? Okay, now go back to what we talked about last unit. I didn't put this on here, you might want to add this. Recession, remember, is when GDP decreases. Okay, so what is recession? Sorry, let me put it up here. Okay, recession, okay, is when GDP goes down. Remember, the official definition is 2 consecutive quarters or 6 straight months of declining GDP. All right, so 2 things that can cause recession. Okay, and let me give you these 2 things and we'll come back and explain them. One could be a decrease in demand, aggregate demand technically. Number 2 could be a decrease in supply. So let's go back to our graph here. Okay, so here is our aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, okay, our supply and demand for the entire economy. Remember, this is GDP. A recession is when GDP is going this way. Right? If GDP is going to the left, that means we're making fewer things. Okay? What would cause GDP to go to the left? Well, let's look at it in the graph. I said it a moment ago, but let's look at it here in the graph. Okay, one could be a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, notice, and this is the important thing, and you will see price level, that price level is going to come down. That's not as important to us right now. It will be in a second. But for right now, the important thing is that GDP declines. Okay, as a result of a decrease in aggregate demand, that would put us in recession. Okay, the other thing that could cause us to go into recession is not a decrease in demand, but a decrease in supply. Remember our good friend Ertl, right? Increase right, decrease left, so we're taking these to the left both times. So if you have a new aggregate supply curve that is shifted to the left, now again, price level changes, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but the most important thing here is you see GDP declines. Okay, so if you see a decrease in demand or a decrease in supply, it is going to put us into recession as an economy, okay? Now, what would cause, let me go back to the notes here real quick. What would cause, sorry for those of you that are OCD about this. Okay, there you go, a little straight line. All right, why would demand decrease? Okay, so here's the key. Think of it as demand has to do with people buying things. Anything that would make it so that people can't buy as many things, okay? So the most common one would be people are out of work and or they don't have money, okay? That would be a problem. What would cause people to be out of work? Well, obviously something that's happening like right now, or it could be the stock market crashes, it could be businesses fail, it could be all these things, anything that would cause people to not have as much money. If people don't have money, they're not buying. If they're not buying, there's less demand for American goods, okay? Or it could be simply people are afraid to buy. Maybe we think a recession is on the horizon, or there's going to be some kind of crisis or something like that, and so people are kind of buckling down. I'm going to save up my money. I'm not going to make those extravagant purchases, go on that vacation, buy the new car, buy the whatever. And so anything that would cause people to not want to buy, that's going to cause a decrease in aggregate demand. What would cause a decrease in aggregate supply? Anything that would cause businesses to not be able to produce as much as they did before. Okay, so examples, think about after Hurricane Katrina. Okay, a lot of businesses were wiped out by that type of natural disaster. War obviously would do the same thing. Think of how many factories and whatnot were bombed in Europe during World War II. Well, now they can't make as many things because they don't have as many factories, okay, and things like that. It could be increased regulations. If the government puts really strict regulations on businesses and prevents them from being able to produce, that could be a problem. Kind of like right now is what's happening. Think of all the businesses that the government essentially has ordered or firmly suggested you are not allowed to produce during this time because of social distancing and this and that. Restaurants forced to close and other types of stores. And so it could be something like that. Or it could be an increase in the cost of the materials used to make a product or the labor, right? If it costs more to make something, I can't make as much of it as I did before. Now, let's apply this to what's happening right now. Okay, let's go back to our graph here. All right, now, why is this such a drastic, dire situation? Well, remember, if you see a decrease in aggregate demand, that puts us in recession. If you see a decrease in aggregate supply, it puts us in recession. What happens when both decrease? Okay, so why did both decrease? Well, again, think of all the businesses that were forced to shut down. That's a lot of people out of work. That's a lot of people not getting a paycheck that they used to get a paycheck, or getting bonuses or this and that, right? So all these people who are now out of work because of the social distancing and the guidelines and all that has caused aggregate demand to decrease. Okay, and like I said a moment ago, all the businesses that were forced to shut down by the government, that's going to make aggregate supply decrease as well. Okay, so you get an aggregate demand decrease and an aggregate supply decrease, and notice that makes GDP decrease even more. Okay, GDP goes down a lot. That's why this is such an unprecedented time. You're really seeing both of these things happening at the same time, and it's creating a pretty rough situation, as we all know. So that's what's happening, and that's why we're going to talk in a second what the government's trying to do to boost us out of this problem, or at least minimize the impact of the problem, okay, with fiscal policy and monetary policy and all that. But anyway, that's recession, okay? Expansion is going to be the opposite. Again, what is expansion? Expansion is when GDP is increasing. Okay, when GDP increases, that's expansion. Now again, come back to our graph, pretty simple. There are two things. In other words, we want GDP to go this way. Okay, we want GDP to increase. What could cause GDP to increase? An increase in aggregate demand. Okay, any increase in aggregate demand is going to cause GDP to go up. The second thing that would cause GDP to go up, which would put us into expansion, is an increase in aggregate supply. Okay, increase in aggregate supply, again, same thing. You get an increase in GDP. Okay, so pretty simple, kind of the opposite of what I just said about recession. Expansion is basically going to be the opposite. So an increase in demand, like we saw on the graph, anything that causes people to want to buy more things. They have more money. Okay, maybe the stock market is doing really well. Maybe the economy is doing well, and people, everyone has jobs and things like that. Or the government's, giving money. We're going to talk about that in a second. Anything that causes people to have more money. Lower interest rates would do the same thing. If interest rates are low, people are more inclined to borrow money to buy things like homes and cars and other things that are kind of dependent on interest rates. And what would cause supply to increase? Again, anything that allows businesses to be able to make more. One of the most common ones, of course, historically, are technological advances, such as the Industrial Revolution. 100 or so years ago, that was a big one. The technological revolution more recently, all these things increase technology and allow businesses to be able to produce more. Sometimes relaxed regulations. Again, if the government relaxes some of the regulations, think about after we get over this thing, hopefully soon, and the government says, all right, businesses feel free to open up again and go back to business as usual. Okay, hopefully that's going to allow more businesses to open up, and that's going to start increasing the supply again. Or if material or the price of labor gets cheaper, that would allow businesses to be able to make more things because it's cheaper to make. Okay, so that would be a cause of expansion. So basically, again, what we're talking about here is what causes the economy to either move forward or go backward. Okay, now we like these two. We like it when either demand or supply increases and GDP grows. Okay, what we don't like, of course, is what's happening right now is when demand or supply decrease, and they're both happening simultaneously, causing GDP to go down. That's a recession. Okay, so the big thing is just understanding why the economy moves forward or why it goes backward. Now, the next question is, what should the government do, if anything, about this? And what we're going to look at right here are the two general strategies that the government can take, what we call fiscal policy and what we call monetary policy. Monetary policy, by the way, we already learned. I'm not going to go through all that again, but I will give you a quick refresher to it. So should the government do nothing, or should the government should the government do something, which is fiscal or monetary policy, or should the government do nothing, which is what we're going to look at the next time we do some notes, and that's sometimes called the classical approach, or the conservative approach, or the laissez-faire approach. You hear all these things used interchangeably, which basically means government hands off. We're just going to let the economy do its own thing. Okay, so that's the question, and we're going to jump into that debate. Don't worry, we'll talk about should the government get involved, should they not, when, all that kind of stuff. But for now, at least just understand the theory. So the first one is what we call the demand side approach, sometimes called the Keynesian approach, named after an economist, John Maynard Keynes. He was very prominent in the 1930s, okay, in particular. Had a big impact on how our government dealt with the Great Depression and some of the strategies and actions that FDR and the government took during that time. And so I want to make this clear. If you say a Keynesian approach, okay, you're not talking about socialism here. We're not talking about the government taking over vast parts of the economy and controlling it and this and that, and redistributing wealth. When you say the Keynesian approach, you're basically just saying the government's got its hand on the steering wheel. Okay, the government is active in the economy, trying to steer it, trying to stabilize it, to make sure that we have good, steady growth, or to take action in time of crisis. Okay, so again, not socialism. I don't want you to misunderstand that, but basically it's just saying the government is taking an active role in the economy. Okay, when you say the Keynesian approach, and we're going to see sometimes it's called demand side, because whether you use fiscal policy or monetary policy, which we'll see in a second, it's going to cause a boost in demand in the economy, and we're going to see why that is. Okay, so the first thing to know, and this is very important, you have to know who we're talking about and the tools that they use. So fiscal policy is the government, and when I say government, I mean specifically the President and Congress, and their use of taxing and spending to influence the economy. Okay, so when you say fiscal policy, that's very important. Okay, we're talking about the government, the President and Congress, and how they use taxing and spending to try to influence the economy. Okay, what do they do in recession? And this should be familiar to you because this is what they're doing as we speak. Okay, because we're dealing with this recession because of the coronavirus. Okay, the response to recession is they're going to they don't have to do both of these, but they could. either going to spend more and or tax less. That's the typical Keynesian approach, fiscal policy approach to a recession. You want to spend more and tax less, because doing one of those two things or both of them puts more money in people's pockets, and that encourages them to spend, and this boosts aggregate demand in the economy. Okay, so the idea here, and think of what the government just passed a week or so ago, a $2 trillion stimulus package. They're going to give most Americans a stimulus check that you're going to get either direct deposit or mailed to you, $1,200 per person, plus $500 for kids, all that kind of stuff. In that $2 trillion stimulus package, there were increased unemployment benefits. There were some money set aside for businesses that are struggling and suffering because of the being forced to shut down or whatever else. There's all this, so they're trying to put all this money in the economy. Okay, so that's a big spending bill. At one time, they did tinker with the idea of getting rid of payroll taxes. If you've had a job, you know that you don't get all the money you earn. You have to pay some of that in payroll taxes. And so, somehow, taking out taxes that way. They didn't end up doing that. At times, they have done that as well. But anyway, either they spend more or tax less. Again, the idea is it puts money in people's pockets and they're more willing to spend. So let's go back to our graph here and show, oops, wrong one. Let's show what we might be dealing with. Again, so right now we're dealing with a scenario where both, well, let's just do one to keep it simple. But again, right now, both of these have actually decreased, okay? So people are not spending as much money because they don't have jobs anymore. So a lot of people out of work, a lot of people making less money. The stimulus bill, what's it trying to do? The stimulus bill is trying to boost that demand back up, getting people money in their pockets so they spend, and so hopefully we come back and we get that GDP moving in the right direction again. That's the whole goal of fiscal policy. It's called expansionary fiscal policy because you're trying to boost or expand the economy, okay? So that's the first thing right there. So demand side fiscal policy in recession, okay, spend more, tax less. Now, in expansion, what do? Okay, now, you might be asking, why are we concerned about expansion? Well, we like expansion. The one thing we might be concerned about, though, is inflation. And I'm going to show you that in a second. But if that was the concern, inflation especially, then their policy is to spend less and tax more. Okay, spend less and tax more. The idea is by taking money out of people's pockets, it's going to discourage them or prevent them from spending and buying things, and that decreases aggregate demand and causes inflation to come down. So again, coming back to this graph. And like I said, you don't need to know this graph, but hopefully you're seeing that being able to read it is really helping you visualize what's happening. That's why I put it on here. So what happens? Let's say that we have a big boost in aggregate demand. Think about, and the problem here is, again, notice what's happening to price level is it's going up. That's another way of saying inflation is happening. Again, we like the expansion in output, okay, or GDP. That's a cool thing. But we get concerned about that price level because of the potential for bubbles. Think of the stock bubble in the 1920s, the housing bubble in the early 2000s. We're going to talk more of those more later on in the unit. But you can run into these problems where you have hyperinflation or inflation is getting too big and you have bubbles. So by spending less or taxing more, you take money out of people's pockets. That decreases demand because they can't spend as much. And again, the key is inflation comes back down. We try to get that inflation under control. Again, expansion we like, we just sometimes get concerned about too much inflation, okay? So that's what they would do typically if we're in a recession. All right, now, automatic stabilizers, okay? So automatic stabilizers are, and this continues on the next page here, but anything that automatically puts this or this into action, okay? So again, the definition on the next page here on mine, probably on yours as well, programs that are already in place that cause the above actions to go into effect automatically, and that's the key, okay? Automatically is the key. It does not take a special action. The stimulus plan that was just passed, that is not an automatic stabilizer. The government had to take a special action and pass that through Congress and get the president to sign it in order to make it happen. What are examples of automatic spend? So remember, in recession, the government wants to spend more. In expansion or inflation, if that's the concern, the government wants to spend less. Well, how does that happen automatically given the system that we have? Well, we have an unemployment system already set up. We have welfare programs already set up, things like food stamps. Okay, so think about it. In a recession, more people are out of work, more people are going to get unemployment. In a recession, people that are still working, a lot of times they get cuts in their pay or things like that. They are less likely to get bonuses and whatever else. They're more likely to qualify for welfare type programs, housing allowances, food stamps, and whatever else. So bottom line is, if we go into recession, more people are going to get these things and government spending will automatically increase. Now, let me add this. The government did recently expand unemployment benefits because of the coronavirus thing. That's another story, okay? That's not automatic because it took a special action to do that. But generally speaking, we have this system set up. Now think about an expansion. When the economy is doing well, people are working, people have money, fewer people are going to get unemployment. Fewer people are going to qualify for welfare programs and food stamps and things like that, right? So automatically, government spending is going to decrease. Again, the key word here, automatic. Let's talk about taxes. Now remember what we said a moment ago. In recession, we'll do that first. In recession, the government wants to lower taxes so that people have more money. And in expansion, the government wants to raise taxes to try to cool the economy off a little bit. Well, how does that happen automatically? Well, here's how our tax system works is generally speaking, we pay based on income. Well, in recession, guess what? People make less money. If you make less money, you don't pay as much money to the government in taxes because you pay based on income. So it's kind of like an automatic tax break or a tax cut in recession because that's what happens when people make less money. And in reverse, in expansion, what happens? People make more money. More people are working. If you make more money, you pay more money in taxes. Okay, so it's kind of like an automatic tax increase in time of expansion. So again, the key is taking what we learned a moment ago, okay, this whole philosophy of in recession, the government wants to spend more and tax less. In expansion, the government wants to spend less and tax more. We have a system in place that kind of automatically does that. Now, as we're seeing, though, the government can also take special actions, and they certainly have been. Okay. Now, real quick, let me run through, and this is a very simplified list of pros and cons. We could debate until rapture about the pros and cons of fiscal policy and all that kind of stuff. Let me give you just a very brief synopsis of the pros and cons. So, the big pro, why is the government passing a $2 trillion stimulus package? The biggest thing is it can give an immediate boost to the economy. Okay, people that are struggling, people that are out of work can get the stimulus check, and that can keep them going for a little while longer, maybe to the economy till things go back to normal and you go back to work again or whatever else, or the unemployment benefits you're getting, or this break you're getting from maybe paying your mortgage or paying your rent that the government is doing, right? So the nice thing about it is it's a very quick reaction and can help people out immediately. Some of the cons is the economy doesn't learn from its mistakes. Okay, we talked about this before. Again, the more if you can let the economy do its own thing, it's better. Okay, again, I've said this before, there are times where government help is needed. I would say this is one of those times. This is a pretty drastic, dire situation for a lot of people. But one of the problems is the economy doesn't learn from its mistakes, and or people become dependent on the government. Okay, so think about it this way. I don't want to get too critical here or off track, but if you follow Dave Ramsey's plan, let's use that as an example, you would have, I think he suggests having 3 to 6 months of an emergency fund set up so that if you lost your job, if something drastic happened like is happening right now, you would still be able to cover your bills. Think of how many people don't have an emergency fund set up. And now they're genuinely struggling because this thing's going on, and now the government's giving you money. Well, if you expect, okay, the next time we go into recession, well, the government's going to bail me out, you are less likely to be responsible, less likely to build up that emergency savings in times like this, and more likely to rely or depend on, okay, the government will just fix our problems every time we get into one. That can be a problem if too many people have that kind of attitude. Not everyone will, but some people certainly will. The other con, and I don't want to get too detailed here because this can be a little bit confusing, is what's called crowding out. The idea here is pretty simple. I'm not going to get into all the interest rates and all kind of stuff at the moment, but basically, if the government's going to spend $2 trillion, they have to get that money from somewhere. Okay, money just doesn't appear out of thin air, right? So the government is either going to have to do one of two things. They're either going to have to tax more, which remember they don't want to do because you don't want to raise taxes in recession, you want to lower taxes. So the government can either tax more, which they don't want to do, or they can borrow. And when they borrow money, it tends to raise interest rates. And again, this is kind of a longer story you need to know. Bottom line is either way, the government in one way or another has to take money from the economy in order to put it back in the economy. And there's kind of an effect where it's just not as effective as it would normally be, kind of a canceling out effect if you want to think of it that way. So that's what's called crowding out. And sometimes you get that. All right, now real quick, I'm going to run through monetary policy because we did this last unit. I'm not going to reteach it. Let me just give you the quicks, the quick basics here. So, response to recession. In a recession, we learned this last unit. What's the Fed going to do? I'm sorry, I completely forgot. I'm going to give you an updated one of these with this on here. But monetary policy is the Fed controlling the money supply. Okay, and again, when you take your quiz on this, you'll see a new one of these with that on there. But I forgot to do that. The Fed controlling the money supply. And this is what we learned all last unit. Okay, so the Fed controls the money supply, either puts money in the economy or takes it out. In recession, what do? Increase the money supply. We learned about that last unit. They're most likely going to buy bonds or buy securities, what's called open market operations, and that puts money in the economy and lowers interest rates. In expansion, they do the opposite. They take money out of the economy, primarily by selling bonds and securities, and that's going to have the effect of increasing interest rates. Now, it's the same idea as we talked about with fiscal policy. This is going to affect demand in the economy, right? Because if you're putting more money in the economy and that money matriculates itself down to people through banks and whatnot, then, well, more money is going to be spent. If the Fed takes money out of the economy, people have less money to spend, there's not going to be as much demand. Again, I'm not going through all the nuances of that because we already learned that, but that's kind of the idea. Just make sure you know the response. All right, and then the pros and cons. The pros, like fiscal policy, can give a quick boost to the economy, and the Fed, if you may have seen on the news, has been putting a lot of money in the economy, and that has had the effect of significantly lowering interest rates, right, because they're trying to fight a recession, because that's what they do in recession, is they put money in the economy, which lowers interest rates, and that can give a quick boost. You also don't necessarily, another pro, you don't necessarily get the crowding out that you can with fiscal policy, because what happens when the Fed increases the money supply, it lowers interest rates, okay, and people are more likely to want to borrow money to buy and spend things and on things and whatnot. So you don't necessarily get that crowding out that you get with the government action, the fiscal policy action. And then lastly, the cons, there is a tendency sometimes for the Fed to overcorrect. In the sense that ideally hindsight is always, we know that hindsight is 20/20. It'd be nice if you could foresee the future with 20/20 vision as well. Of course you can't. So sometimes the Fed is more, maybe to say another way, the Fed is more reactionary as opposed to being proactive in dealing with the economy. After the housing bubble bursts, then they come into play. After the stock market bursts, after the coronavirus thing happens, they come in and they start changing things. And so there's a tendency sometimes to go and jerk the wheel back too hard the other way, put too much money in the economy or take too much money out of the economy or whatever. And so that can create some problems with loose money supply. So that's what you get there. So I know that's a mouthful. I know that's a lot. Obviously, this is a complicated story, but this is stuff that's happening right now. The key thing, remember, know the difference between fiscal and monetary. Fiscal is the government using taxing and spending. Monetary is the Fed changing the money supply. What does the government do in recession? Well, with fiscal policy, in recession, they spend more or tax less. In expansion, they spend less and tax more. And then the Fed, in recession, as you see here, they increase the money supply, put money in the economy, and in expansion, when inflation's the problem, they take money out of the economy, okay? So that's that. I know that's a lot. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. But again, look around, read the news reports. You're going to see this stuff literally being happening in front of our eyes as we speak. So it's kind of cool in the sense that we actually see this being played out as we're talking about it right now. So until next time, again, keep yourselves healthy. Hopefully I see you guys sooner than later. And as always, I miss you guys and hope you all are doing well. Thanks.